So, in the last couple videos I had, one of them I just went through the Common Intermediate Language. And I'm supposed to go through a programming language with you guys, but I just do not have a proper syntax made up as of yet. I wrote down the list of keywords, but I just don't have a proper syntax. So I thought for this video I would talk about all the computers I used to own. And you know, I see a lot of people on YouTube that really talk about their favorite video games, or they show themselves playing the video games, their favorite video games, or their favorite machines that they used to own or they still own. So I thought this one I would talk about my favorite computers. Not going to get so much into why or how I got into computing, because I think that would be a story left best for another time. So the very first computer that I owned, this was my computer, it belonged to me, it didn't belong to anybody else. It was the Apple IIc. The very first computer I owned was an Apple. And I liked it. Like, people who are into computing always remember their first computer. Their first computer will always be special to you. In any way, it will always be special to you. And this machine was special. And not because, you know, it's Apple, or I hold, you know, I hold Apple to a certain light, but no, it was the capabilities of this machine. So coming out of April 1984, we didn't have much back then as far as resources go. But this one had, I can pull it up here, it had 128 kilobytes of RAM, up to 1.125 megabytes. But I had the 128K model, and that was plenty. That was plenty to work with. Some machines had the Apple DOS, but no, mine didn't. Mine didn't ship with DOS. You just plugged it in, turn it on, but it did have an Apple Basic baked into the ROM. So you plug it in, you get it set up, you turn it on, away you go. You start programming in BASIC. And that was my universe. I liked it. Of course, that was the only thing I had. So it had a 6502 CPU at 1.1 and some odd megahertz. And I liked it. We liked it. And it was green phosphor. It was a green phosphor screen. It was green text on a black screen. You can see here. No hard drive. No hard drive meant that you had to save all your data in the floppy drive. So you can see it on the corner here. Or I had this too. I had the external 5 1/4 inch floppy that plugged into, one of the ports at the back of the machine, and you had the little stand that the monitor sat upon. Yeah, I know that was good. Then I got. It wasn't my computer, but it was sort of the family computer. It was a I think it was like it was a thing where everyone could use it. The computer that we had, I know it was a Intel 486. I just can't remember the manufacturer. But by the time I started using that, now the Intel 486 in comparison to the Apple II, holy fuck, that thing was a tiny god in a box, like compared to the Apple II. I think the particular one that I used was a 25 megahertz CPU, 8 megabytes of RAM. Now we're going into RAM with megabytes. And that was a big fucking deal to me. I think it had like a 100 megabyte hard disk with Windows 3.11 that we bought at the time, because in actuality the 486s were used well into the 1990s, despite having been built in the 80s. But we had that computer. I still used the Apple IIc at the same time. Like the basic programming languages. It's easy enough to learn. It's easy to sit there, start pumping out programs, save it to the floppy disk. Then you had a reset button. So anything you were working on, you hit the button. But of course, everything that you were working on in memory was gone. Now this was the 2C Plus. I had the regular, just a straight up 2C, because you had the keyboard where the text on the screen would go either 40 or 80 columns, right? Like the amount of text fitting across the screen. And if you push that button, you can go 80 columns. And the volume slider, my volume slider was on the side of the computer. And of course your little kickstand here, flip it over, and you had the whole computer and a keyboard, kind of on a slant to type. But I still kept this when I had, and I got this when I was 12 years old. It came with a lot of the floppy disks. Some were blank and some had some games. I think it had, I remember playing some Star Trek game. It had Pac-Man. That was pretty good. I think those are the only two games that came with the computer. That was given to me. It was my own computer, nobody else's. So yeah, then I got the 486. 46 CPU from Intel, and this is what it actually looked like. You had ones that that you could mount a fan on top of it. No, that's overdrive. This is what they actually look like. and there's a spot in the computer, there's a spot on the motherboard, there's a second socket, but it wasn't like it was a dual CPU. You had your main, that could have been here, your coprocessor. Your coprocessor would take some instructions that were offloaded from the CPU and do all of the x87. It basically do all floating point calculations is what this did, and it really alleviated the amount of tasks that were done on the Intel 46 and all the generation of CPUs before it. So that was that, like, you know, just in a generic beige case, 486, 25 megahertz. You know, did that for a few years. Well, that's pretty fucking cool. Yeah, and this is, you know, a stark reminder of what it was like. All the add-in cards. You had a separate add-in card for controlling the hard disk, a separate add-in card for video, for sound, for networking. You needed a separate add-in card for a printer. Memory had to be installed in pairs. You could not get away with installing one memory stick. You needed to install it in pairs. And that could have been a CPU right here. But some of them had the CPU in the bottom right hand corner right here of the motherboard. And then, after you had installed all your components to get a working computer, you had to go into the BIOS. For your hard drive, you had to set manually, of course, the amount of cylinders. And if you're lucky, you had a hard disk that came with the documentation. And you had to go into BIOS and set manually for the hard drive. You had to manually set number of cylinders, heads, sectors, properly set the amount of jumper switches for that. And that's one thing I don't miss doing, because it was a pain in the ass to fucking set up. So yeah, that's what the board looked like. So you had your memory, you had your DIMMs, you had extra empty sockets here to install more memory beyond what we're shipped with, and you have all your ISA slots here. This would have been your BIOS. This is your main, this is your CPU, and this is where your coprocessor would have, where it would have been installed. This is the place. So this is where your keyboard would have been plugged into, and that was great. That was it was an okay computer. I mean, it wasn't like, I mean, it took me back a bit, you know, because the difference between it and the Apple II. But it wasn't really, to me, it really wasn't that great. Like, it wasn't really anything special. So yeah, that's a closer look of how it went into the main board here. Then I worked a summer job to pay for a Pentium. But around that time I got the Pentium because it was cheaper. It's a little bit cheaper than what was out at the time already, you know, versus a Pentium 2 or a Pentium 3. So I had my Pentium Pro, 200 megahertz. God, I don't know. Maybe it could have been 32 megabytes, maybe 16 megabytes of RAM. And the hard drive on that was actually really good. If anyone watching remembers the Quantum line of hard drives, maybe I can pull it up. But those things never quit. Come on. Hard drive support from Quantum. But I believe these guys got bought out by Seagate. No, they got bought out by Maxtor. Yeah. And eventually they became Seagate. But no, I had a Quantum 1 gigabyte drive that had Windows 95 installed on it. But the hard drive was really fucking impressive, because there came a point where it suffered from the click of death. And my initial thought, oh great, a dying drive. But no, it kept on going. They don't make hard disks like they used to, I tell you that much. And if anybody here who has ever built a hard disk knows that they do not make hard disks like they used to. Then I got into, so the Pentium, I had the Pentium Pro. I had a Pentium 2 given to me as a gift, which was the socket, not the socket, the slot. Then it came out with the Xeons, but no, I think it was Pentium 2, 350 megahertz. There's actually a rather sizable amount of RAM. I think the machine I had was at around 64 megabytes of RAM and a few gigabytes of hard disk space, so I'm starting to get a little better now at this point. So I think at around the when I had the Pentium, when I bought the Pentium, I just stopped doing I just stopped playing with the Apple. Like, I mean, you know, we were having computers, you know, like the Pentium and Pentium 2 and so on, where it just wasn't really viable. You know, at that point, that was my reasoning at that point. It wasn't viable to keep using the Apple anymore. But of course, I have a different opinion about that today. So and of course, with the Pentium 2s, you had models that were fanless, and some of them you had ones you can get with the fan installed, but it worked just as well without the fan. It worked just as well being a passive heatsink. Then I got in, yeah, here's a dual socket Pentium Pro. And look at that, it looks like it takes DIMMs. Fuck, hey, how neat is that? Some PCI slots and ISA, but DIMMs. Because the Pentium Pro that I had only took SIMs. Wow. Then I got the Pentium 3. That was a great machine. It was 733 megahertz, and it was blazing fucking fast. I paired it with the memory from my old machine, the Pentium 2. So with 64 megabytes of memory, a 733 megahertz CPU, throw in a 4 gigabyte drive. I tell you, it was blazing fucking fast. Then I got I worked a considerable amount of hours to save up for a Pentium 4. I think the Pentium 4s came out, I can't remember when, maybe 2001. So the Pentiums, like all the Pentiums, I was a little late to the party, but I consider myself fortunate to be able to have used those particular products produced from 2000 to 2008. Okay. I had my Pentium 4 in 2003. The socket 478. The or was it this one? I can't remember. Might have been this one. This particular socket, my Pentium 4. Prescott, March 2004. Yeah, mine would have been either Willamette or Northwood, but the Prescotts were okay too. I mean, the Pentium 4 in day-to-day computer usage, like it was okay, you know. Then we had hyperthreading, which was kind of a big deal then, where you had two concurrent threads running at the same time on your CPU. That was about the time I only heard about what AMD was doing. You know, I never really played. I never had a chance to play with one of their chips. But it wasn't until I left school, because I broke my Pentium 4. So I had to go back to the Pentium 3. I was kind of happy about it because, you know, so I started working again in a computer store in my city. I had enough money to buy a new computer, or enough money to buy enough parts for the computer because I already had memory and I already had a hard disk. So I went out to the computer store and they had on sale a bundle of the main board that came paired with the AMD Athlon XP, some model, I can't remember. But I took a gamble on it because it was cheaper. It was a hell of a lot cheaper than the Pentium 4. So I said, sure, I buy it. I take it home, I install it, I do a fresh install. And let me tell you, I'm glad I went with that. I stood by that purchase decision because it was a great computer. The Athlon XP, yeah, it was fan-fucking-tastic. And if you think that was fantastic, if you think the Athlon XPs were great, 6 months later, I purchased the AMD Athlon 64. And if you think the Athlon XPs were great, well, because I did, when I got the Athlon 64. Holy crow. An x86 CPU with 64-bit extensions that ran 32-bit operating system and 32-bit software in a 64-bit address space was fucking amazing. And if anybody remembers from that time, Intel and AMD were going toe to toe. But AMD had the upper hand with the Athlon XP and the Athlon 64. So yeah, that was a great computer. Definitely one of my favorites. I started with the entry model. I think it was the Athlon 64 3000. Athlon 64 2800. Could have been 2800. September 2003. Yeah, gosh. Yeah, mine was a socket 754. The first ones they released. Maximum CPU clock rate 1 gigahertz to 3.2. And mine was a 2.8 gigahertz model. Hyper transport 800 to 1000 megatransfers per second. Yeah, a lot of people were building their computers with the Athlon 64 because it was better at gaming and among other tasks. But gaming was the big thing. 'Cause I think AMD was the first to move the memory controller off the mainboard and into the CPU. I think that was them that did it. And it supported DDR memory. Not DDR2, but the initial ones supported DDR memory. Yeah, and it was blazing fucking fast. So I did that for a while, and oh my god, I broke it. I broke this chip. I went out and bought an aftermarket cooler. So I come back home with the thing. I turn off the computer. It's on my table. Cover's open. I'm getting ready to do it. So I'm fiddling with the heatsink. And anybody who knows, who's dealt with the socket 754s, know what I'm talking about. I was fiddling, not pulling too hard, but I'm trying to jimmy the heatsink off the chip, and it gave way. So I felt like a pull, and I pulled it up. Like, okay, I got it out. Oh, where's the CPU? Oh, it's on the bottom of the heatsink. Fucking broke it. Oh, I was choked. Go back to my Pentium 3. I had to go back to my Pentium 3 until I could afford a new chip, because I tried putting it back in and it didn't work. It wouldn't post. The computer wouldn't post. So I was choked. So I figured, okay, I'll go out and buy a new CPU, a better one, a slightly better one, when I have the money to do it. So when I did do that, the computer worked again. I was like, oh fuck, thank fuck, I don't have to buy a whole new system. Oh, and prior to the me being on AMD, taking the plunge into AMD, Intel was all I knew back then, like with the exception of Apple. Intel was all I knew. There's a third guy out there, but they don't cater to OEM they're not in the OEM or consumer market. So um, so I got socket 939 about a year or two after that. Just another single core chip, and it was okay. Like, I mean, you know, like at this point, it's lost its pizzazz, you know. But they're still great for gaming. You know, I did the whole PC gaming thing back in the day, and I still game, you know, but not as much. Um, Athlon 64, 3000 to 4000, model 3000 to 4000. Yeah, I remember that. I remember wanting an FX really badly. I really wanted an FX chip. Um, yeah, then they came out with the dual core Athlon 64s. A buddy of mine had one of those, and that was actually pretty good. You know, having a true um, dual core CPU. And I had that for a long time actually. The 939. Then we got FM2. What did I do after that? I was into AMD for a long time. Probably almost as well, not really quite as long as I owned Intel, but a considerable amount of time I was spent buying AMD. Um, and a lot of people would agree that, you know, if your hobby is gaming or you have a gaming PC, and you're on a budget, AMD is the way to go. Like, even now, and even before the release of Zen, before the release of Ryzen, it was, if you're on a budget and you want a game, that was AMD was the way to go. You know, if you had a budget of $400-500, that was the way to go. And that's probably their market. That's probably their demographic. Budget computing. We'll have to see where Ryzen is going. More on that in a little bit. I think after that I bought then I was into Phenom. The AMD Phenom. It was a 4-core. Orleans, 90 nanometer CPU stepping. No, mine was it was a Phenom 2 actually, because I skipped a generation. I didn't have the Phenom. I went right into Phenom 2. DDR2 is a 3 gigahertz machine that I had purchased with 12 gigabytes of RAM because it was triple channel, and that was a good machine too. That was a good one. Because I never owned a multi-core CPU, and this would have done it for me. 2005. Oh no. I really went all out into purchasing that computer. Yeah, a substantial amount of funds went into that computer. Phenom 2 945. I bought one of the you know, the special edition, no, the black edition CPUs. Yeah, I think this was it. Phenom 2 Black Edition. multi-core CPU. Hey, that looks like the motherboard I used too. No, mine was triple SLI. And I even went out and I bought 2 video cards just so I can say I had SLI in my computer. I had 2 NVIDIA cards just so I can say I had it. This one was special to me too because I really went all out on it. This one has 4, but mine had 3 PCI Express slots. It had a couple of the legacy PCI slots as well. It had SATA. It had a couple of ATA ports as well. But no, it was a tremendous computer. And I still own it. It's sitting in my closet. And I used that. I used that until I bought Intel. I went back with Intel. Like not this computer. This is just a Mac. You can tell what the thing. But I have another computer, PC that runs Windows. Yeah, I'm back on Intel now, but I still have the Phenom 2. Yeah, and it had the huge. Yeah, I bought the aftermarket cooler with the huge heatsink. It was a bigger fan than this. I think it was a 120 millimeter fan. I think GeForce 9500 GT. I think that was the card. Yeah, that was the one. I had 2 of these. Well, almost went all out on the computer. Because I think the 9800s at the time were running 400 each. And these are running 200. So the amount of money that I spent, like 200 each on these, could have been spent buying the 9800 just one. But I got it in my head that, you know, SLI, it looks cool, it sounds cool, I want to do it. But I did it, but I don't have regrets on that. But NVIDIA did have a bad batch of drivers. They did have some bad drivers around the summer of 2010. I remember that because some games had some micro stutter, and it wasn't just me. I knew a few individuals who had NVIDIA cards reported micro stutter in their games as well. And so that was then. Well, that's past. The computers I use now, in present day, the computers I'm using now, I got a PC, just like in a simple box, like nothing fancy like I used to do. It's a simple black box that houses all the components. Has a Xeon, 16 gigabytes of RAM. You know, I threw in a couple of solid state disks for RAID. I got a backup disk. E3. Yeah, it's got one of these in it, Xeon E3, from Haswell. It's from the Haswell batch. Got another computer sitting in my closet. It's a dual socket. It's a dual Xeon from it's the server. It's the Xeon from Core, when Core architecture was first released. That's it. Nehalem, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, um, but both the Xeons and my other computer are from Nehalem days. I played around with that for a bit, and it was it's an HP pre-built, so that's a pretty decent computer. So yeah, really the Apple II, the Pentium 3, the Athlon XP, the Athlon 64 were really my favorites. I've had hands-on experience with a lot of computers, and coming into present day, coming into now. So as you can see here, I'm doing this on the Mac. It's the 2014 Mac Mini. And it has been a tremendous computer, for the price and the size, and because Apple figured out how to make their Mac Minis smaller. And it's been a good experience. It's a good computer, fairly decent. The amount of money that I spent on. Oh, what an accident! Going into the future, we're seeing a lot of unique form factors going into the future, like the Intel Compute Stick, and this is the size of, if you're not familiar with it, it's a computer the size of a USB stick, but instead of plugging it into a USB, you plug it into a display that has HDMI. And you can, of course, plug in a USB device into this. I can't make up this, but it's a computer the size of a USB stick. And, well, there's a teardown of it. Yeah, that's what it looks like on the inside. So I wouldn't mind, going into the future, I wouldn't mind at least trying. I mean, if it's at a cheap enough price point, I would consider purchasing it. Another computer out there is called the Raspberry Pi, and it's being touted as a very small form factor computer. And yeah, this is what it looks like. So you got Ethernet. It is Wi-Fi capable. It's got a few USB, whatever that thing is. Oh, HDMI, okay. 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, I want to say. And of course your 40-pin GPIO header right here. So those are the two I would at least like to try or buy. you know, if it's at a cheap enough point, price point. I think it's going for $100. But and all the accessories that come with it. Any other? I think that's really it. Like, I mean, I've had some hands-on experience with really obscure machines, really rare and obscure machines. This place I used to work at gave me the exposure for a lot of these machines, these computers. Probably, this book probably documents the assembler. Probably teaches you assembler of that CPU. I think the Raspberry Pi uses ARM, Advanced RISC Machine. No, that's probably it. Like, I mean, well, um, I have Apple's iPad, and it's fairly decent for what it's capable of doing. I guess not really much else to say.